saying who you are and why you're here.
Yeah, my name's Quinn McFrederick. I'm an entomologist and assistant professor at the University of California, Riverside. I'm here as part of the Wedges Against Hunger because I study bees, and bees are responsible for a large part of global food production. The statistic that bee biologists like to put out there is that bees provide 1 in 3 bites of food for the world. So around 33% of global food production is reliant on bee pollinators. So that's my interest in agriculture and food production.
And can you tell us a little bit about the bee colony collapse disorder?
Yeah, so colony collapse disorder is a symptom of larger problems that started in honeybees around 2006, and the symptom is that you go into what was previously a healthy beehive and you find that almost all the bees are gone, and the queen is left behind with just a few workers, and that means that colony is not going to survive. A healthy colony is a lot of bees, like 50,000 bees. If the queen only has 50 bees surrounding her, that's not enough to take care of her and make sure that she can lay enough eggs for that colony to recover. And so there's been huge losses of honeybee colonies since 2006. People are still attributing those losses to colony collapse disorder, although the commercial beekeepers also attribute losses to other causes such as pesticides and parasites and such. There's not a smoking gun about what causes colony collapse disorder. There's not one single cause, but we think that it's sort of a perfect storm of causes. Habitat loss, new pesticides, new diseases, etc., all sort of coming together to cause this new sort of symptom. And there's even controversy about how new it is and how real it is as well. The bottom line is that colony losses are still, for honeybees, are still much higher than they were in the past. So before 2006, people would lose maybe 15% of their colonies, 20% of their colonies. It's been on average above 30% of honeybee colonies are lost every year. For example, last year we lost about 40% of our colonies. Some of that happened during the winter, but some of that also happened during the rest of the year. So that's what's really worrisome for people, especially beekeepers. At this point, the beekeepers have been able to replace those lost colonies. So it doesn't mean we're losing 40% of our colonies every year. It doesn't mean that the number of colonies is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. What it means is that beekeepers have to work harder and harder and harder to keep the number of colonies up. So they can split their colonies. They start a new colony by getting a new queen and taking half of an old colony and putting that with the new queen. So they can replace their colonies. It's just much, much more work and much more management. So in the long term, is it sustainable? Probably not. Losing 40% of your colonies every year makes beekeeping that much harder of an industry, that much harder of a job to be able to do. And it's been largely, the beekeeping industry has largely been sustained by almond pollination services. The almond growers have to have bees for their crops. Almonds are an extremely successful crop, and they've been able to pay beekeepers more and more and more, and so you can still make money as a beekeeper, but it's getting to be a harder and harder job.
And the current trajectory, what impact will the bee colony collapse have on us and our food systems?
So because bees are responsible for so much of global food production, if we keep losing colonies year after year after year, it all sort of depends on the economics of will almonds continue to have such high demand? They sell a lot of almonds to China now, and if China stops, if the Chinese economy goes down and there's not the same demand for almonds that there are in China, you could envision a scenario where beekeepers aren't paid as much for almond pollination. Beekeeping becomes non-sustainable. A lot of people get out. Some of that knowledge for beekeepers, many of the beekeepers that you meet are multiple generations of beekeepers. They're from families with multiple generations of beekeepers. So it's not very common to meet a beekeeper that's just recently gotten into it and has a large scale commercial operation. Most of the commercial beekeepers come from families of multiple generations of beekeepers. So if those people get out of beekeeping, you could see a situation where there's no longer honeybee colonies available for other sorts of crops besides almonds. That's one of the reasons why. So the likelihood of that scenario happening, I can't put a sort of probability of that scenario happening. I can't put a number to that probability. I think it's a possibility. I don't think it's probably the most likely outcome. I think that there'll always be some demand for beekeepers, and some people are going to stay in it. We might find situations where there's only a few very, very large beekeepers left, and we might even get into situations where there's a loss of colonies, where we don't have as many colonies across the country anymore. That's one of the reasons that people like myself and others study other types of bees, because honeybees are just one type of pollinator, and across the world there's 20,000 different species of bees. The bees that we use for pollinating almonds are just one of those species. So there are lots of wild bees, and we know that in certain situations those wild bees can actually be better pollinators than honeybees. We don't know how to manage those wild bees like we know how to manage honeybees, and that means that we rely on honeybees very heavily now. But there's lots of people that are interested in finding ways to conserve those other bees for pollination of crops, just in case we do lose honeybees. We need an insurance policy, and that insurance policy for pollination for sustained food production could be our wild bees. So protecting the biodiversity that we have left is extremely important for sustainable pollination services for the future.
And what can people do to help the bees, or help pollinators in general?
Yeah, how can people help pollinators is actually one of my favorite questions that I get asked. And I think there's multiple things that people can do. First and foremost, we need to support science. There's been, in recent years, there's been sort of a back anymore. And maybe that's because they don't know, they were never trained how to look at those data themselves. And so as an educator, that's one of the things I really try to do, is even when I teach non-major classes, train my students how to look at data and interpret data so they can learn how to trust science themselves. So we need to support science, and that means that we need to vote for Congress people and presidents that believe in science, and I think that really what made America the country that it is the science that's behind it. The science that we've supported in the past, like our cell phones, that all came from federal grants. All of the technology in our cell phones originally came from money that were given to scientists via federal grants. So all of our great innovations come from government support of science, and we need to make sure that that continues in the future. So supporting science is one thing that people can do. If they want to do something more immediate, more hands-on, we can plant pollinator-friendly plants in our gardens. So that's a huge thing that we can do. When I first started out, I studied bumblebees in urban areas, and one of the things that we found was that the more open space there is, the more resources there are for bees, the more likely you are to find them there. So if you plant pollinator-friendly plants, especially a variety of plants that will flower throughout the year. So bees like honeybees and bumblebees need resources throughout the year. If you have a bunch of flowers just in the spring, that'll help certain species of bees, but it won't help species of bees that need resources in the fall. So if you plant a variety of flowers, some that flower in spring, some that flower in summer, some that flower in the fall, and all of those species are attractive to bees, you can really make a large difference. There's another thing that people can do to attract native bees into their gardens is to put out what we call bee hotels. So there's lots of bees that like to find old beetle burrows, for example, so holes in wood, and you can replace those sort of holes in wood by collecting reeds and plants that form straw-like structures, and you can actually make those into really interesting art pieces that look really nice in your garden that bees and other sorts of insects will then occupy. None of those bees are going to sting you, is the nice part. Most bees are very uninterested in stinging you, and when they sting you, it's on accident. So providing food resources, providing nesting resources in your backyard, those are all important things that people can do. And another thing that people can do is to use pesticides responsibly and to try to support organic farming whenever possible. There's no way that we can feed all of the people in the world without some use of pesticides, and there's situations where pesticides have to be used. Like in Southern California right now, we're very worried about this citrus greening disease, which could wipe out our citrus industry. So the citrus industry has to use pesticides, but figuring out ways to use pesticides that minimize their impacts on bees is very, very important. And in fact, lots of backyard gardeners use more pesticides than they need to use. So the over application of pesticides to backyard gardens is a real problem for bees. So minimizing use of pesticides, minimizing purchases of crops that need lots of pesticides, those can also help bees as well.
And your research at UCR is actually on the microbiome of bees. So how does that play into all this?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So when I first started out, I started out as a sort of traditional conservation biologist. So trying to understand how we can make parks a nice place for bees to survive in, how we can attract bees to parks and make them, instead of population sinks, places where bees can become more robust and abundant. And what I kind of quickly figured out is that we know that bees need lots of wild habitat. Like, that's the number one thing that we can do to save bees, is to set aside wild lands and not disturb those wild lands. So that's almost like a policy issue at this point. So as I move forward in my science career, I decided to really try to focus on other ways that I might be able to protect bees. We know that pesticides are a large problem for bees. We know that parasites are a large problem for bees. In recent years, we've discovered that there's microbes that live in the guts of bumblebees and honeybees that are very specific to those bees and are very important for bee health, and they might even play roles in protection of bees from environmental toxins. So I have a student who's studying how the bumblebee gut microbiota protects those bees from toxins that get into nectar and pollen when plants grow on soils that have a lot of those toxins. So we're trying to find ways that we can use the bacteria in bee guts to protect bees from environmental insults. I have a postdoc in my lab who's shown how the bacteria that live in the bumblebee gut also protect. He's discovered the mechanism by which they protect the bee from an intestinal parasite. So that, again, hopefully we can leverage that to increase the the bees' population sizes and make those bees more abundant. So the theme of my lab and the reason that we study microbes is that we're really trying to leverage those microbial symbionts in ways that we can increase pollinator health and pollinator populations and ensure that we have those pollinators for the future.
And my final question is, we're here at the Wedges Conference talking about different aspects to help with food insecurity and food waste issue. What do you think is the most important aspect of this for the future? In short, what is your wedge?
What is my wedge? I would say, I'm as a bee biologist and a ecologist, molecular ecologist, I think that biodiversity is actually the most important thing for us moving forward. The reason that I say that protecting biodiversity is the most important thing for ensuring that we have food for the future is that we haven't yet identified the right type of bacteria that we might be able to put into soils to increase nitrogen fixation. We haven't identified the right bacteria out there that can outcompete bacteria that aren't as good at nitrogen fixation. We haven't yet identified the very best pollinator for every single crop. So in the absence of that sort of scientific knowledge, we need to make sure that we don't lose those species that are super important for us. So we know that moving forward, we have to be more efficient at agriculture. We have to be more efficient at the way we use land. And to do that, we need to discover new tools. Those new tools exist out in nature. The only way that we're going to be able to discover those tools is if we make sure that they exist and are maintained. So to me, protecting biodiversity is the most important thing for us moving forward.
All right, thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Ella.